Millions of people enter this river every day. They drink the water, they wash their faces. They believe it can heal, purify, and save their souls. Science says this water should not even be touched. To understand why faith continues where biology fails, you need to look beneath the surface of the Ganges. They enter the water slowly. Some pray, others cry. Many drink. The river's surface appears tranquil. The movement is constant, almost hypnotic. Millions of people have repeated the same gestures for centuries, immersing their bodies, washing their faces, touching their foreheads, swallowing a little water. For them, it's no ordinary river. It's a living goddess. But just below that surface, something is moving. Human ashes still warm, fragments of bones, remains of burnt tissue, entire bodies that never reached the bonfire, bacteria that science cannot eliminate, pathogens that survive where nothing should survive. And yet, the ritual continues. Every day, along hundreds of kilometers, the same river receives the dead, the sick, pilgrims, children, animals, raw sewage, and prayers, all mixed together, all accepted, all absorbed as if it were part of an invisible order that no one dares to question. There are no warning signs. There are no real road closures. There is no silence. There is faith. And there is something deeply disturbing about watching millions of people entrust their health, their salvation, and their dead to water that anywhere else on the planet would be considered unfit even to touch. The Ganges River is not just a waterway. It is an extreme biological system, a flowing cemetery, an ancient organism that carries on its banks the promise of liberation, and in its bed, evidence of something that has never been purified. Today, you will enter this river, not as a pilgrim, not as a tourist, but as a witness. And after that, you'll never look at him the same way again. The Ganges River originates in the glaciers of the Himalayas and flows through northern India like a sacred artery. It stretches for over 2,500 kilometers, its water considered divine and revered by millions of people every day. For Hinduism, the Ganges doesn't symbolize a goddess, it is the goddess, a conscious being capable of washing away sins, liberating souls, and breaking the cycle of reincarnation. To die on its banks, or to have one's ashes scattered in its waters, is seen as one of the greatest blessings possible. And this belief is not recent. It has survived empires, invasions, epidemics, and centuries of social transformation. The world has changed, science has advanced, but the ritual has remained. The problem is that the river has changed too. The modern Ganges carries more than just mythology. It carries industrial waste, urban sewage, human remains, dead animals, and microorganisms that defy basic sanitation protocols. Yet no one stops the flow. No one questions it aloud. Because questioning the Ganges is not just questioning a river, it's questioning the very idea of purity, of salvation, of faith. Throughout this video, you will follow the true story of the Ganges, not the tourist version, nor the watered-down religious version. We will walk along its banks, observe the rituals, understand what happens to the bodies, what science has found in the water, and why, despite all this, millions continue to enter it every day. Before we continue, comment below, where are you watching this from right now? This story spans continents and perhaps says more about humanity than about a river. Because the Ganges is not just sacred, it is a mirror, and what it reflects is not always comfortable to face. The Ganges didn't begin as a river, at least not in the minds of those who worship it. Before touching the earth, it existed in the sky. In the oldest narratives of India, the Ganges flowed through the upper worlds, far from humans, as an unstoppable force. Its water was not only clean, it was too powerful. Descending to earth unprepared would mean destroying everything in its path. Forests would be uprooted, mountains dissolved, entire cities swept away like dust. And yet, someone asked it to come down. A king named Bhagiratha sought something no army could achieve, to liberate the souls of his ancestors, condemned to wander restlessly. For this, he needed the water that purifies even the karma accumulated over generations. He needed the Ganges. Years of penance followed. Silence, immobility, the body reduced to a minimum while the request became an obsession, until, according to tradition, the impossible happened. The goddess heard. But the problem wasn't convincing the Ganges to flow downstream, it was preventing it from destroying the world in the process. The solution came from an intermediary, a god who accepted the impact of the fall. When the Ganges finally plunged from the sky, it didn't touch the earth directly. First, it was absorbed by Shiva's hair, long, intertwined, endless. The water fragmented, lost speed, divided into thousands of strands before flowing gently to the ground. Thus, the Ganges was born, domesticated. From that moment on, water came to carry two inseparable meanings: purification and containment. Something too powerful to be free, but too sacred to be controlled. Something that needed to flow, even if it was dangerous. This origin shaped everything that came after. Because if the Ganges is divine, then it cannot be impure. If it purifies, then nothing that enters it can contaminate it, not even death. And this is where the myth ceases to be just an old story and begins to justify very real actions. Centuries later, when the first bodies began to be cremated on the banks of the river, there was no moral conflict. The fire liberated the soul. The water received what remained. It was a perfect cycle, controlled, sacred. But the world did not remain small. The shores filled up, the cities grew, and the volume of deaths began to outpace the rhythm of the ritual. Still, nobody stopped. Because when a culture believes that a river cannot be contaminated, it also believes that everything that happens within it is absorbed, not accumulated. And this belief has endured for centuries without ever being truly tested, until the river itself began to send back signals. The fire appears before the smell of water. In some cities along the Ganges, the fire never goes out. It burns day and night, in rain or extreme sun. The funeral pyres operate in invisible shifts, fueled by silently piled wood and bodies arriving wrapped in light fabric, carried by family members who have repeated this journey many times before. Here, death is not a rare event, it's routine. The bodies descend stone steps worn down by centuries of human footsteps. Step by step, the weight increases, not only of the body, but of meaning. Each person who arrives believes they are fulfilling the last possible act of love, delivering someone to the liberating river. But liberation comes at a price. Not all bodies are completely cremated. Wood is expensive. Time is limited. Children, pregnant women, ascetics, and victims of certain illnesses are not burned. They are considered too pure to be burned. Their bodies go straight into the water, tied to stones, carefully pushed towards the center of the current. Some sink, others don't. During periods of high water, the river returns what it has received. Swollen bodies slowly emerge, swirling on the surface among boats, pilgrims, and offerings of flowers. Sometimes they're collected, sometimes they are not. And yet the ritual continues just a few meters away. Men wade into the water up to their waists to purify themselves. Women wash their faces. Children play on the bank. The same current that carries human remains also touches the mouths of those seeking healing, salvation, or forgiveness. Silence is not awkwardness. It's normal. At this point, the Ganges ceases to be mere scenery and becomes spiritual infrastructure. It resolves what the city cannot contain: excessive death. It absorbs, carries away, dissolves. Or at least, that is what is believed. But the river is not infinite, and what enters it does not disappear. With population growth, the number of daily cremations has surpassed any previous predictions. Ashes accumulate. Human fat forms invisible films on the surface. Organic tissues fragment and drift downstream, feeding something that doesn't appear in the rituals but grows silently. Microorganisms. They do not distinguish between sacred and profane. They do not recognize myths. They do not participate in faith. They merely survive. And while the fire consumes bodies on the shore, something invisible begins to adapt within the water. Something that learns, something that resists, something that silently transforms the Ganges into an environment that shouldn't exist. When science decided to venture into the Ganges, it wasn't out of spiritual curiosity. It was out of necessity. Hospitals in riverside towns began to record strange patterns, infections that did not respond to common antibiotics, simple wounds that progressed too quickly, recurring intestinal diseases in people who claimed to drink only the purified water from the river. For a long time, these accounts were treated as coincidence: poverty, lack of sanitation, malnutrition. The Ganges, after all, couldn't be the problem. To question it was to cross an invisible line that mixed science with blasphemy. But the data started to accumulate. Water samples collected from different points revealed something disturbing: extreme concentrations of fecal bacteria, active human viruses, heavy metals, and industrial waste. In some sections, the biological load exceeded the limits considered safe by the World Health Organization by thousands of times. Near Varanasi, one of the most sacred cities on the planet, researchers recorded levels of fecal coliforms that exceeded WHO parameters by more than 5,000 times. The water was not just contaminated, it was an environment that defied the very definition of limits. And yet, there was something more. Among the common microorganisms, researchers found bacteria that simply shouldn't be alive in that environment. Highly resistant species capable of surviving in water saturated with pollutants, organic debris, and chemicals. Some demonstrated multiple resistance to modern antibiotics. Others seemed to thrive precisely where the contamination was highest. The Ganges had become a natural laboratory of extreme selection. An environment where everything that enters, human, animal, chemical, or biological, is forced to coexist, where only what adapts remains, where constant death creates ideal conditions for something even more persistent. And what was most disturbing wasn't the existence of these bacteria, it was the direct contact with them. Millions of people enter the river every day, some with open wounds, others with weakened immune systems. Many drink the water without any treatment, trusting in the promise of spiritual purification to compensate for physical risks. Faith functions as a psychological shield, but not as a biological barrier. Later studies showed that certain infections associated with the Ganges region were not confined to the river banks. They traveled. People returned to other cities, other countries. They carried with them something invisible, incubated, silent. The river didn't end where the water stopped. It continued inside the bodies. And as the data became clearer, a question began to circulate among scientists, always in hushed tones. To what extent could this extreme environment be creating something new, something that didn't exist before? Something shaped by decades, perhaps centuries, of constant contact between death, waste, and living organisms. The Ganges wasn't just polluted, it was evolving. At various points in recent history, the Ganges has been officially at risk. Reports were written, conferences were held, cleanup plans were announced with solemn speeches and grandiose promises. Billions were allocated to pollution control projects. Treatment plants were planned. Educational campaigns were even launched. Nothing has really changed.
Because the Ganges is not just a polluted river, it is a psychological, religious, and political pillar. Any attempt at intervention immediately runs into a simple and dangerous question. How can you clean something that by definition cannot be dirty? If the river is divine, then admitting its contamination is admitting a flaw in cosmology itself. It's not just an environmental mistake, it's a symbolic rupture. And symbolic ruptures have consequences. Governments back down, authorities downplay the issue, religious leaders remain silent, the official discourse becomes carefully ambiguous. The Ganges may be under pressure, overburdened, affected by external factors, but it is rarely described as what the data clearly shows, one of the most biologically dangerous rivers on the planet in certain stretches. Meanwhile, cities continue to dump sewage directly into the water. Industries use the river's course as a disposal route. Hospitals release medical waste. None of this happens in secret. Everything is visible. Everything is normalized. Because interrupting the flow would be interrupting the ritual, and the ritual cannot stop. The cremations continue. The offerings continue. The immersions continue. The Ganges needs to receive, always, even when you have received too much. There is a specific kind of silence that forms in these places. It's not ignorance, it's a choice. The collective choice not to look directly at something that threatens to destabilize everything. But water doesn't negotiate, it carries, it accumulates, it spreads. They arrive in silence. Some come from afar, brought by family members in crowded trains, makeshift buses, or carried on improvised stretchers. Others walk alone, too weak to explain the reason for their journey. They all have something in common. They believe that this is the right place to die. For many Hindus, the Ganges is not just a river of purification, it's an escape. To die on its banks means breaking the cycle of rebirths, settling a spiritual debt accumulated over entire lifetimes. It doesn't matter how one lived, the place of death can rewrite everything. That's why they come. Simple hostels receive people in terminal condition, small warm rooms with windows overlooking the river. There, time is counted differently. There is no medical emergency. There are no attempts to prolong what is already running out. The wait is peaceful, almost organized. When the end comes, the body descends rapidly to the shore. The ritual needs to be effective. There are others waiting. Cremation takes place in a few hours, sometimes in minutes. The wood is measured. The fire is controlled. The body is reduced to its essentials. What remains goes to the river. But not everyone arrives on time. Some die before being taken to the pyre. Others lack the resources for the complete ritual. In certain cases, the decision is straightforward. The body goes whole into the water, tied up, pushed in, delivered. The Ganges receives everything without distinction. At this point, the river ceases to be merely a witness to death. It becomes a final destination on an industrial scale, a practical solution to something no modern city can manage, the excess of bodies.
And the more people arrive there to die, the more normal it becomes. Death loses its weight as an event. It fits into the daily flow like just another activity. The shock disappears. The smell becomes familiar. The constant presence of the end ceases to cause emotional disruption. But the river feels it. Each body adds organic matter. Each incomplete cremation adds waste. Each direct delivery alters the composition of the water. Not in a symbolic way, in a measurable way. The Ganges does not judge, but it accumulates. And while people continue to come there to die, others continue to come to live better, to heal, to start over. The same point on the river serves as a final farewell and symbolic rebirth. Two opposing movements in the same space, in the same water. There is a stretch of the Ganges where the contrast is almost unbearable. On one side, the pyres still smolder. ashes slowly descend the stone steps and mingle with the dark water. The smell of burnt wood lingers in the air, clinging to clothes, skin, and the heavy silence of those who have just said goodbye. On the other side, just a few meters away, people enter the river seeking exactly the opposite. They dive in carefully. They fill their hands. They bring the water to their face, their mouth, their chest. Some close their eyes. Others murmur specific requests: healing from an illness, fertility, protection, forgiveness. The gesture is repeated with ancient precision, taught since childhood. To an outsider, the proximity between these two worlds seems absurd. To those who live there, it's natural. The logic isn't sanitary, it's symbolic. The water that receives death is the same water that dissolves what life cannot resolve on its own. What enters impure leaves purified. What ends returns transformed. This is the equation that sustains everything. And it works until it doesn't work anymore. At certain times of the year, especially during major religious festivals, the number of people on the river multiplies explosively. Millions enter the water at the same time: open wounds, exhausted bodies, immune systems overwhelmed by the heat and the journey. It is in these moments that the fragile balance breaks down. Infection cases are increasing. Diseases are spreading with unusual speed. Hospitals improvise extra wards. Authorities urge caution but never discourage the ritual. The message is always indirect, carefully formulated so as not to offend the central belief. The result is a repeated cycle: massive exposure, localized outbreaks, silence, normalization. And what's most unsettling is that even when healing doesn't come, faith is rarely shaken. Illness isn't seen as a failure of the river, but as part of a larger process, something that needed to happen, something that has meaning even when it hurts. This interpretation protects the symbol, but it leaves the body exposed. At this point, the Ganges ceases to be just a place. It becomes a continuous test of human limits. How far is someone willing to go when they believe that risk is part of the path to something greater? The human body is adaptable, more so than people like to admit. In regions where the Ganges is part of daily life, constant contact with the water begins early. Children enter the river before they learn to read. The skin gets used to it. The stomach learns to tolerate it. The immune system is trained, little by little, through repeated exposure to agents that elsewhere would cause immediate outbreaks. This creates a dangerous illusion, that of resistance. Many people live for decades without experiencing serious symptoms. They work, raise families, and grow old on the banks of the river. For them, the Ganges doesn't seem like a risk. It seems like a silent ally, a constant presence that has never failed. But adaptation is not invulnerability. It's merely a delay. Over time, the body begins to pay the price: chronic infections, persistent intestinal problems, recurring skin diseases. Cancer cases in riverside regions appear at rates difficult to explain solely by genetic or dietary factors. The damage is not explosive, it is cumulative, and that is what makes it invisible. There isn't an exact moment when you can point to the river and say, "It happened here." The impact is diluted over the years, mixed with poverty, limited access to health care, and the normalization of pain. The Ganges doesn't kill dramatically, it wears you down. Still, there are times when adaptation fails brutally. Epidemics emerge without warning: localized outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, hepatitis, overwhelmed hospitals, dehydrated children, elderly people who don't survive. During these periods, the discourse changes for a brief moment. Water is labeled dangerous. Contact is discouraged. Warnings are issued. But only for a while. When the crisis passes, the ritual returns. Because the problem was never seen as structural, it was always treated as an exception, a momentary deviation from something that deep down needs to continue. The Ganges cannot stop. The people cannot stop. Faith cannot stop.
And so, the human body continues trying to keep up with an increasingly extreme environment. Some succeed, others do not. Most live in a fragile equilibrium, sustained more by repetition than by security. But there is something the body cannot do: distinguish belief from contamination. It only responds to what enters it. For a long time, the Ganges sustained a contradiction without collapsing. He was at the same time a source of life and a repository of death, an absolute symbol of purity and a biologically unstable environment. This tension did not explode because it was diluted over time, spread among millions of individual gestures that in isolation seemed too small to cause an impact. But systems don't collapse all at once. They give warning signs. In certain stretches of the river, the water's behavior changed. Persistent foam began to form on the surface, not as an occasional sign of pollution, but as a permanent state. The smell became stronger at specific times of the year. Certain species of fish disappeared, while others, more resistant, began to dominate the environment. The old balance began to tilt. These changes weren't just aesthetic, they were indicators. The Ganges was becoming an environment where ordinary life could no longer compete, where only what could tolerate extreme levels of pollution survived, where the concept of normal ceased to exist. And this directly affected people. Communities that depended on the river for fishing saw their main source of food become unpredictable. Farmers irrigated crops with water laden with invisible residues that accumulated in the soil and entered the food chain many kilometers after being dumped. The contamination ceased to be localized and became structural, incorporated into daily life without warning. What is most disturbing is that even faced this evidence, the public discourse remained almost unchanged. The Ganges continued to be described as eternal, resilient, and self-healing. The narrative that it cleans itself persisted, even when the data showed otherwise. Because admitting instability meant admitting limits, and limits don't mix with the sacred. But biology doesn't respect narratives. Overburdened environments begin to produce unpredictable responses: mutation, resistance, new interactions between organisms that previously did not coexist. The river, pushed beyond what any natural system should withstand, began to react in ways that were difficult to predict. And that's where the greatest risk arises: not what is already known, but what has not yet clearly manifested itself. The potential for something to emerge slowly, nameless, faceless, until it is too late to separate cause and effect. The Ganges doesn't need to cause an immediate catastrophe to be dangerous. It just needs to keep going, keep accumulating, keep selecting, keep spreading. When some researchers started using the word irreversible, they weren't speaking out of provocation, they were describing a technical point, a limit. Natural systems can recover up to a certain level of pressure. After that, they don't return to their previous state, they simply reorganize themselves into something different. Not necessarily dead, but permanently transformed. In many sections, the Ganges has already passed that point. Even if all sources of pollution were stopped today, something that won't happen, part of what has accumulated in the riverbed would remain active for decades. Contaminated sediments, heavy metals, microorganisms adapted to extreme environments. It's not just about cleaning the visible water, it's about dealing with a biological history buried beneath the constant flow. The river carries memory. Each generation added something to that memory without completely removing it. Ashes, debris, sewage, industrial chemicals, medications. The result is an environment that cannot simply go back to what it was, because what it was no longer exists. And that's a problem without a simple solution. Deep interventions run into logistical challenges, cost issues, and cultural resistance. Superficial interventions produce quick visual results, cleaner riverbanks, symbolic campaigns, but don't alter the core of the system. The Ganges continues to function as it always has, receiving everything. What's most unsettling is that biologically, it's not failing, it's adapting, creating a new kind of balance sustained by organisms that thrive where others cannot exist, an ecosystem shaped by excess, not scarcity. This means that the risk is not immediate, but diffuse. It is not a visible collapse, but a silent change at the base, something that only becomes evident when it is already too integrated to be isolated. And while this is happening, the public narrative remains almost unchanged. The Ganges continues to be presented as eternal, purifying, and untouchable. The distance between the symbol and the real system widens, creating a void where difficult decisions are simply not made. Because any real decision would require admitting something uncomfortable, that not everything that is sacred is sustainable, that faith, when protected from any questioning, can end up exposing precisely those it intends to save. The river doesn't ask permission to change. It changes because it needs to continue existing. The Ganges has never belonged solely to India. It only seems distant to those who have never truly needed to look at it. What develops in such an environment is not confined by borders, passports, or beliefs. Microorganisms do not respect maps. Food chains do not follow political lines.
After passing through sacred cities, agricultural fields, industrial zones, and densely populated areas, the river continues. It widens. It mixes with other waterways. It enters the Bay of Bengal, forming one of the largest deltas on the planet, a gigantic, living, pulsating system. And everything the river carried to that point does not disappear. Contaminated sediments accumulate at the bottom of the delta. Microorganisms remain active in the groundwater that feeds wells in villages hundreds of kilometers from the main waterway. Organic waste enters the food chain of coastal waters. Fish absorb toxins over months of constant exposure. Animals feed on them. People consume these animals, not only in India, but in countries that import seafood from the region. The water evaporates from the delta, forms clouds, rains in other latitudes, seeps into the soil, and returns to the groundwater as if nothing had happened. The cycle closes. What began as a local ritual spread as a systemic phenomenon, not intentionally, not out of malice, but through persistence. Researchers began observing worrying patterns in regions far from the main course of the Ganges River. Certain bacterial strains, highly resistant to antibiotics, were appearing in places with no direct link to hospitals or dense urban centers. In some cases, the same genetic sequence was detected in samples collected at international ports thousands of kilometers from India. The hypothesis was unsettling. Extreme environments like the Ganges could be acting as natural incubators of biological resistance. Not a conspiracy, a side effect. The more aggressive the environment, the greater the evolutionary pressure. The more pressure, the more unexpected adaptations. The river, unintentionally, became a filter, a continuous testing ground where only the most resistant microorganisms survived, and they traveled. Meanwhile, on the banks, life went on as normal. People woke up early, went into the river, prayed, worked, washed clothes, prepared food. The contact was daily, constant, intimate. The Ganges was not visited, it was lived. And this created a paradox that was impossible to resolve with cold data. Because for millions of people, the river didn't cause illness, it healed, not symbolically. Accounts of physical improvement, unexpected remissions, and improbable survivals were associated with faith in the Ganges. Real cases, personal experiences, stories passed down from generation to generation. How can we confront this with statistics? How do you tell someone who believes they were saved by that water that it could also be the source of something invisible, incubated, delayed? Science measures risks. Faith measures meaning. And when these two things come into conflict, it is rarely faith that retreats first. The real risk isn't an isolated outbreak or an alarmist headline. It's the normalization of an extreme environment that has functioned for decades as an incubator for biological resistance, a place where bacteria learn to survive the impossible, continuously exposed to discarded antibiotics from hospitals, medical waste, and constantly decaying organic matter. This kind of evolutionary pressure doesn't create movie monsters. It creates slow, persistent, and difficult to contain problems. And the modern world is especially vulnerable to this because it depends on mobility. People enter and leave the Ganges, workers, pilgrims, tourists, migrants. Contact is real, transfer is possible, often inevitable. A worker returns to his country carrying an infection that has not yet manifested itself. An exporter sends contaminated fish to a supermarket on another continent. A child who played on the banks years ago now lives in a European city and still carries in his immune system the traces of what he learned on the river.
Still, almost no one talks about this outside of technical circles, because altering this narrative requires addressing something larger than an environmental problem. It requires acknowledging that the idea of sacred can act as a shield against difficult decisions. Which traditions, when left unquestioned, can create zones where risk accumulates unchecked? But here's the most unsettling part. This isn't unique to the Ganges. The river merely exposes, in an extreme way, something that happens in many places around the world: the human tendency to protect symbols even when they come into direct conflict with physical reality. The collective choice to preserve meaning, even if it requires ignoring clear signs of wear and tear. Pollution that persists in areas protected by cultural heritage. Health risks ignored at religious festivals around the world. Structures that no one dismantles because demolishing them would mean questioning something that the entire community has decided to consider untouchable. The Ganges only attracts more attention because everything there happens in broad daylight. Death is visible. The ritual is public. The flow is continuous. And perhaps that's exactly why he's so bothered, because it forces the observer to confront a question that is rarely asked honestly. To what extent are we willing to accept real risks to keep intact ideas that comfort us? And this question doesn't only pertain to India, it pertains to any society that transforms symbols into untouchable objects. The Ganges continues to flow. It does not interrupt its rituals. It does not correct its excesses. It does not defend itself against human projections. It just carries it. It carries beliefs. It carries bodies. It carries residue. It carries consequences. And perhaps that's what makes it so powerful and so disturbing at the same time, not because it purifies everything it touches, but because it reveals, without words, the cost of everything we choose not to face. This was another episode of Sacred Roots. If you've made it this far, comment, what other sacred place do you think holds a contradiction that almost no one dares to face? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue traveling with us through the most mysterious and uncomfortably real places on our planet.